They came in silk and silver, one after another, a procession of noble daughters ascending the steps of the Iron Throne like offerings laid before a god who had forgotten how to want. Lady Seraphina of the Eastern Vale presented a chest of raw sapphires, mined from the deepest veins of her father's territory. She curtsied low, her golden hair cascading like a curtain, her smile practiced and precise. The Alpha King did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the far wall of the great hall, where torchlight carved shadows into ancient stone, and his expression held all the warmth of a winter grave. Lady Cordelia of the Northern Ridge brought a sword forged in dragonfire, its hilt wrapped in white wolf leather. She knelt and offered it with both hands, her voice steady and reverent. "For the king who has no equal in battle." He lifted one finger from the arm of his throne. The beater beside him, a scarred giant named Halvard, stepped forward and accepted the blade on his behalf. The king never touched it. They'd been arriving for 3 days, 47 women from the strongest packs in the realm, each one selected by her alpha father to compete for the position every she-wolf in the kingdom coveted. Luna to the Alpha King, Queen of Wolves, mate to the most powerful creature walking the earth. And Cale Thornvane, Alpha King of the Iron Sovereignty, High Lord of the 5 territories, the wolf who had not smiled in 300 years, sat on his throne of carved black stone and felt nothing. Not boredom, not irritation, not even the dull ache of obligation. Nothing. The curse had taken everything else long ago. It had started with warmth, the ability to feel the sun on his skin, the heat of a hearth, the comfort of a fur cloak in winter. Then it took taste, then color. The world had faded to shades of grey and iron sometime around his 2nd century. Then it reached deeper and began to consume what remained of his ability to feel anything at all. Joy went first, then grief, then anger, which had been the last thing keeping him sharp. Now there was only a vast, frozen silence where a soul should have been. His wolf, once a roaring force inside his chest, had gone quiet decades ago. It still lived. He could feel it the way one feels a limb gone numb. But it no longer spoke, no longer surged, no longer cared. 300 years of rule, 300 years of ice. The 48th woman was stepping forward now, another lord's daughter in emerald velvet, and Cale's attention had already drifted to the window behind the throne, where grey sky pressed against grey stone, and the world looked exactly as dead as it felt. Then the crowd near the doors shifted. A murmur rippled through the great hall, not the reverent hush that accompanied each noble presentation, but something uglier. A scuffle, a sharp voice, the sound of someone being shoved. Cale's gaze moved to the back of the hall, not because he cared, because movement was movement, and even a frozen king tracked disturbance. She was small. That was the first thing he registered. Small and thin, and wearing a dress that had been washed so many times its original color was a matter of speculation. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a braid that had come partially undone, and there was a bruise on her jaw, fresh, purpling at the edges, that she made no effort to hide. 2 guards had her by the arms. A thick-necked lord behind her, Lord Maron of the Ashwood pack, Cale recognized him distantly, was gesturing toward the door with obvious disgust. "She is no one," Lord Maron spat, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "A kitchen rat. She followed the procession like a stray and should be removed before she embarrasses this court further." The girl did not struggle against the guards. She did not beg or explain or cry. She looked directly at the throne, directly at Cale. And something inside him, something that had not moved in so long he had forgotten its name, shifted. His wolf opened one eye. "Release her." The words left his mouth before his mind had authorized them. His voice was low, rough from disuse. He had not spoken unprompted in weeks, and it cut through the great hall like a blade drawn across stone. Every head turned. The guards dropped the girl's arms as though they had been burned. Halvard leaned in, his scarred face creased with concern. My king? Kale ignored him. His gaze had not left the girl. She stood alone now in the aisle between the rows of nobles, small and battered and utterly still, and she was holding something in her hands. Not a chest of jewels, not a weapon, not a scroll of alliance. A piece of bread. Dark, coarse, the kind baked in village ovens by people who could not afford flour fine enough for a lord's table. It was half-eaten. She had been saving it. She walked forward. The silence in the great hall was absolute. The kind of silence that falls when every wolf in a room senses that something unprecedented is happening, and none of them understand what. She stopped at the base of the throne's steps. She did not curtsy. She did not kneel. She looked up at him with eyes that were dark and steady and completely unafraid, and she held out the bread. "You look hungry," she said. If you enjoy stories like this one, take a moment to hit that like button. It helps more than you know, and it tells me you want more. Not hungry for power, not hungry for conquest or alliance or the strategic mating that every wolf in this room had come to negotiate. Hungry. As if she could see through the crown, through the throne, through 3 centuries of ice, and find the starving thing underneath. Kale stared at her. The great hall stared at him. 47 noble daughters in silk and jewels stared at the ragged girl who had just offered their king a crust of bread with the same gravity they had offered fortunes. He reached out and took it. His fingers brushed hers, and for the first time in 300 years, Kale Thornvane felt warmth. Not metaphorical warmth, not a poetic suggestion of emotion. Actual, physical warmth. Heat blooming from the point where their skin touched, racing up his arm, flooding into his chest like sunlight pouring through a crack in a frozen wall. His wolf surged awake with a sound that was not a growl, but a roar, a deafening, desperate, joyous howl that reverberated through every nerve in his body and nearly drove him to his feet. Mate. 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 The bread trembled in his hand. His fingers had closed around it with a grip that was almost savage, and his eyes that had been flat and grey and dead for longer than anyone in this room had been alive, blazed gold. The girl saw it. She saw the shift in his irises, the impossible colour flooding through grey like molten metal, and she took one step back. Not in fear, in recognition, as if something inside her had answered, and the answer terrified her. "What is your name?" His voice was barely human. "Elowen," she said. "I am no one's daughter. I belong to no pack. I came because I was hungry too." Lord Maron stepped forward, his face twisted with outrage. "Your Majesty, this creature is an Omega. Lower than an Omega. She was cast out of the Ashwood pack for—" "Halvard." Kale's voice dropped to a register that made the torches on the walls gutter. "If Lord Maron speaks again without my permission, remove his tongue." The silence that followed was not the silence of reverence. It was the silence of fear. Kale descended the steps of his throne. He had not descended those steps for any of the 47 noble daughters. He had not risen from his seat in the 3 days of this procession. Every wolf in the room knew the significance of what they were witnessing, and every wolf in the room was terrified by it. He stopped in front of Elowen. She barely reached his chest. Up close, the bruise on her jaw was worse than it had appeared, layered, the kind that came from repeated blows, not a single strike. Her hands were calloused, her wrists were thin. She smelled of wood smoke and wild thyme, and something beneath both that made his wolf press against his ribs so hard he thought the bones might crack. "You will stay," he said. It was not a request, but it was not a command either. There was something fractured in it, a need so raw it had no armor. Elowen looked up at him. The gold in his eyes was fading, flickering, as if the warmth was already trying to retreat. She could feel the cold radiating from him beneath that single point of heat, an abyss of frost that went down and down and down. "I have nowhere else to go," she said quietly, "but I will not be kept." The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile. The ghost of a memory of what a smile had once felt like. Then stay because you choose to. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Behind them, in the watching crowd, Lady Seraphina's hand clenched around the arm of her chair until the wood creaked. Beside her, an older woman in black, Vespera, the king's late mother's former advisor and the most powerful female wolf in the court, watched the scene with an expression that held no surprise at all, only calculation. They gave her a room in the East Tower. It was sparse but clean, a narrow bed, a hearth, a window that overlooked the inner courtyard where warriors trained at dawn. It was the finest room Elowen had ever occupied, and she stood in the center of it for a long time, listening to the wind against the stone, trying to understand what had happened. She knew about mate bonds. Every wolf did, even the cast-offs, even the ones raised in kitchen corners and sleeping on stone floors. The bond was sacred, involuntary. The wolf recognized its other half before the mind could interfere. But she had never shifted, not once. She had been told all her life that she was defective, too weak, too small, too broken to carry the wolf that should have lived inside her. Lord Maron had used that as justification for everything. The beatings, the starvation, the years of labor without status, without protection, without a name that anyone bothered to learn. If she had no wolf, how could the bond have formed? She pressed her palm to her chest, where something had fluttered when his fingers touched hers. A sensation like a heartbeat that wasn't her own, quick and fierce and achingly warm. A knock at the door. She opened it to find not a guard but a small, round-faced woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron.
"I am Marta,"
the woman said simply. "I ran the kitchens. I brought you something to eat." She held out a tray, warm stew, fresh bread, a cup of something that steamed. "And I wanted to tell you, before anyone else does, that the last woman who held the king's attention was Lady Thessaly. She was beautiful and ambitious, and she told everyone she would be Luna within the month." Elowen took the tray. What happened to her? Marta's kind eyes went flat. "She vanished 3 months ago. Vespera said she left of her own accord, but her belongings were still in her room, and her horse was still in the stable." She paused. "Be careful who you trust in this place. Not everyone who smiles at you wants you to survive." The door closed. Elowen sat in the edge of the narrow bed, the warm stew untouched, and thought about the woman who had vanished and the advisor who had watched today's scene with calculating eyes. He found her in the library 3 nights later. Chaol had not meant to seek her out. He had spent the intervening days in the state he knew best, conducting audiences, reviewing territorial disputes, commanding his forces with the mechanical precision of a king who ruled by competence rather than passion. The warmth from her touch had faded within hours, and the cold had rushed back in with a vengeance, deeper than before, as if the curse were punishing him for the momentary thaw. But his wolf would not be quiet now. After decades of silence, it paced and snarled and pulled toward the East Tower with a single-mindedness that bordered on madness. So he told himself he was walking the corridors for security. He told himself he heard a noise. He told himself several lies in rapid succession, and then he was standing in the doorway of the library, and she was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the dying fire, reading a book that was nearly as large as her torso. "You can read," he said, and then hated himself for the surprise in his voice. Elowen did not look up. "An old healer taught me, when I was 7. Lord Maron had her whipped for wasting time on an Omega. She taught me in secret after that." She turned a page. The firelight played across her face, softening the bruise, which had faded from purple to yellow-green. She looked, for a moment, less like a cast-off and more like a scholar. "What are you reading?" "A history of the Bloodfrost curse." Now she looked up, and her dark eyes were sharp with something that was not accusation, but was very close to it. "Fascinating subject. Particularly the section about how it was cast." Chaol went very still. 312 years ago, Eowyn continued, her voice quiet but steady. A witch named Morwen cursed the Alpha King's bloodline after his father executed her daughter for practicing unsanctioned magic. The curse would consume him slowly, first warmth, then sensation, then emotion, then his wolf, and finally, his life. It could only be sustained by a living anchor, someone close to the king who fed the curse with their own will. She closed the book. Someone in this fortress is keeping you dying, Your Majesty, and they have been doing it for 3 centuries. The fire cracked. A log collapsed in a shower of sparks, and the sudden flare of light caught the gold that had flooded back into Chaol's eyes. You found this in 3 days, he said, and his voice held something that might have been wonder if the curse had left him enough to feel it. I found it because I looked. Has no one else? The question landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Because the answer, the one he had never allowed himself to examine, was no. No one had looked. Not Halvard, who was loyal but incurious, not his advisors, who managed the curse like a chronic illness, treatable, never curable. Not Vespera, who had served 3 generations of the Thornvane line, and who surely must have... He stopped. Eowyn watched the thought arrive on his face. She did not speak. She waited, the way you wait when someone is reaching the edge of a truth they have been circling for a very long time. Vespera, he said. She has been at court for 300 years, Eowyn said carefully. Since before the curse. Since before Morwen. She was your mother's closest advisor, and your mother's before that. That does not make her... When Lady Thessaly began to get close to you, she disappeared. Eowyn's voice did not waver. Marta told me. And tonight, when I asked Marta who assigned this room, this specific room in the East Tower, isolated from the rest of the court, she said Vespera. The cold inside Chaol's chest clenched like a fist. Not the curse's numbness. Something worse. Something that felt, impossibly, like the beginning of fear. Why are you telling me this? Eowyn stood. She was still so small, still barely level with his chest, but there was nothing small about the way she held his gaze. Because you took my bread, she said. And because I think you have been starving for a very long time, and no one in this fortress has cared enough to ask why. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, not threatening, desperate. He stood close enough that she could feel the unnatural cold radiating from his skin, close enough that his breath should have been warm against her forehead, but was not. His hand rose and stopped, trembling, actually trembling, an inch from her jaw. If I touch you, he said, and his voice was wrecked, barely above a whisper. The warmth comes back, but it leaves again. And each time it leaves, the cold is worse. The curse fights it. Eowyn reached up and took his hand. She pressed it to her cheek, and the warmth flooded through him like a dam breaking. Not just heat, but sensation, texture, the impossible softness of her skin, the flutter of her pulse beneath his fingers, the scent of wild thyme and wood smoke so vivid it made his eyes sting. Then we will have to be faster than the curse, she said. Vespera struck the next evening. The great hall was assembled for the feast marking the end of the procession. The noble daughters who had not yet departed sat in places of honor, their gifts displayed along the walls. Chaol had not announced a Luna. The court simmered with speculation. Eowyn entered the hall in a dress Marta had found for her. Simple, deep green, clean. She held her head high. Every eye tracked her. Vespera stood before the procession was half through its meal. I invoke the right of challenge, she declared, her voice ringing through the hall like a bell struck in iron. For the protection of this pack and this throne. The woman called Eowyn is wolfless, packless, and nameless. She is unfit to stand in this court, let alone beside the king. I challenge her claim. The hall erupted. Wolves surged to their feet. Halvard reached for his sword. Chaol's hands gripped the arms of his throne, and the stone cracked under his fingers. but Elowen spoke first. I accept. Every voice died. Cale turned to her, his eyes blazing gold, his wolf thrashing with a fury that made the air in the hall feel charged, electric. You cannot. A challenge is a fight. She is a ranked wolf. She will... I accept, Elowen repeated. She did not look at him. She looked at Vespera, and there was no fear in her expression, only a certainty that went bone deep. Vespera smiled. It was the smile of someone who had maintained a curse for 3 centuries, who had silenced anyone who got too close, and who fully intended to end this complication the same way she had ended Thessaly. Tomorrow at dawn, Vespera said. In the fighting circle, before the full pack. The hall emptied slowly, wolves murmuring, casting glances between the frail girl in the green dress and the powerful advisor who had never lost a challenge. Cale remained on his throne, his knuckles white on broken stone, his wolf howling inside a body that could not give it voice. When the hall was empty, Elowen came to him. She is the anchor, she said quietly. I am certain of it. She has been feeding the curse for 3 centuries, keeping you frozen, keeping you controllable, keeping every woman who might break through away from you. Then let me kill her. His voice was barely controlled. I am the Alpha King. I do not need a challenge to. If you kill her by force, without proof, the pack fractures. Half your lords followed her before they followed you. She built those loyalties deliberately. She needs to be exposed, publicly, in a way that cannot be denied. And you think a fight will do that? Elowen placed her hand over his. The warmth surged between them, and this time Cale gasped, actually gasped, a raw, involuntary sound that tore from his chest like something breaking free. Color bled into the edges of his vision. The torchlight was not grey, it was orange, gold. The stone beneath his hands was not numbness but texture, rough, cold, real. I think, Elowen said, that when she tries to use the curse against me in that circle, everyone will see exactly what she is. And if she kills you first? Elowen's hand tightened on his. Her dark eyes held his golden ones, and in them was the quiet, ferocious determination of a woman who had survived starvation, beatings, exile, and erasure, and who had decided, not hoped, decided, that she would survive this too. Then you will know the truth, and you will finish it. He pulled her toward him, not gently. His arms closed around her, and his face pressed into her hair, and the warmth spread through him like wildfire, like the first day of spring after an ice age, and he held her as though she were the only thing keeping him from sinking back into the void. Elowen. Her name in his mouth was not a command, it was a prayer. I have not felt anything in 300 years. I cannot lose the first person who made me feel again. She pulled back just enough to look at him. Her hand found the place over his heart, where beneath the ice the wolf howled and the man trembled. You will not lose me, she said. I did not walk into this fortress to die. I walked in because I was hungry, and you looked hungrier than anyone I had ever seen. Dawn came cold and grey. The fighting circle was ancient, a ring of standing stones on the plateau behind the fortress, overlooking a valley of dark pines. The entire pack surrounded it, breath fogging in the early light. Warriors, lords, servants, the noble daughters who had lingered to witness. Every wolf for miles had come. Vespera entered the circle in her wolf form, massive, black-furred, her eyes burning violet with power that no ordinary wolf possessed. The crowd murmured. She was enormous. She was magnificent. She was 300 years old, and radiating a force that pressed against the skin like a coming storm. Elowen entered in her human form. She wore the green dress. Her feet were bare on the frozen ground. She carried nothing. Lord Marin, watching from the crowd, laughed. The Omega cannot even shift. This will be over in seconds. Kale stood at the edge of the circle, his entire body rigid, his wolf screaming against the invisible barrier of tradition that prevented him from intervening. Halvard stood beside him, one massive hand on the king's arm, not to restrain him, to anchor him. Vespera struck first. A blur of black fur and violet light, she lunged across the circle with killing speed. Her jaws aimed for Eloin's throat. Eloin did not dodge. She did not run. She raised one hand, and light erupted from her palm, not the violet of Vespera's stolen power, but a blinding golden-white radiance that hit the black wolf mid-leap and sent her crashing backward across the circle. Vespera struck the standing stones with a crack that echoed off the mountains. The crowd went silent. Eloin stood in the center of the circle, her hand still raised, and the light pouring from her was not just light. It was warmth. Visible, tangible warmth that melted the frost on the stones around her feet, that made the cold morning air shimmer like summer. She is a Solaris wolf. Halvard's voice was a stunned whisper beside Kale. I thought the line was extinct. So did Vespera, Kale said, and his voice held something it had not held in 3 centuries. Wonder. Vespera rose. She shifted to her half-form, human body, wolf's eyes, claws extended, violet energy crackling around her hands. And in her rage, her control slipped, and the curse became visible. Threads of dark energy, like veins of black ice, stretched from Vespera's hands across the circle, across the plateau, and into the fortress behind them. Every wolf present could see them. Every wolf present could trace them to the source. 300 years. Kale's voice was quiet, but it carried across the plateau like a funeral bell. 300 years you kept me frozen. You killed Thessaly. You maintained the curse that my father died from. You let my mother believe it was her bloodline's weakness. Vespera bared her teeth. Your mother was weak. Your father was weak. This kingdom needed guidance, not feeling. I kept this pack strong while you rotted on your throne and called it ruling. You kept me in a cage, Kale said, and called it a crown. Eloin brought both hands together. The golden light intensified, burning along the threads of dark energy, following them back to their source. Vespera screamed, a sound that was not just pain but the unraveling of 3 centuries of accumulated power. The curse shattered. It broke with a sound like ice cracking across a frozen lake in spring, a deep, resonating fracture that rippled outward from the circle and washed across the plateau like a wave. Every wolf felt it. The oppressive weight that had hung over the iron sovereignty for 300 years lifted in a single, devastating instant. Kale dropped to his knees, not from weakness, from overwhelm. The world exploded into color and sensation. The deep green of the pines, the blue-gray of the morning sky, the red of Halvard's cloak, the warmth of the sun breaking through the clouds and hitting his face for the first time in 3 centuries. He could smell the pine sap and the cold earth and the distant rain. He could feel the rough stone beneath his knees. He could hear every heartbeat in the crowd and, above them all, louder than any other, one steady rhythm that his wolf locked onto with absolute certainty. Hers. Vespera collapsed in the circle, the violet energy gone, her body diminished. She looked old for the first time, ancient, spent, the centuries catching up in the space of seconds. The guards moved in without being told. Kale rose. He walked into the circle. The crowd parted for him with a reverence that had nothing to do with fear for the first time in living memory. Eloin stood in the center, the golden light fading from her hands, her breathing unsteady. The power had cost her. Her legs trembled, and there were tears on her cheeks, though her expression was fierce and unbroken. He stopped in front of her. The entire pack watched. The noble daughters watched. Lord Maron watched, his laughter dead on his lips. Kale took the crown from his own head, the iron crown of the Thornvane line, black metal forged in wolf fire, the crown that had burned every hand that touched it for 3 centuries. He placed it on Eowyn's head. It did not burn. It settled against her dark hair as though it had been waiting for her, and in the morning light, the black iron gleamed with a warmth it had never held before. "Eowyn," he said, and his voice broke on her name the way a river breaks through a dam. Not weakness, but release. Luna of the Iron Sovereignty, my mate, my equal. The woman who brought bread to a starving king and broke the chains that everyone else called tradition. He knelt before her, the Alpha King, on his knees, before a woman who had been called nobody, nothing, worthless. Around the circle, one by one, the wolves of the Iron Sovereignty dropped to their knees. Halvard first, then the warriors, then the lords, then the noble daughters who had brought sapphires and swords and alliances. Lord Maron was the last. His knees hit the ground like a man who had just realized that the kitchen rat he had beaten and starved was the most powerful wolf he had ever stood beside. Eowyn looked down at the king kneeling before her. She touched his face, both hands, cradling his jaw, and the warmth between them was no longer desperate or fleeting. It was steady, permanent, a hearth fire that would never go out. "Stand up," she whispered. "Kings do not kneel." "This one does," he said. "For you. Only ever for you." 3 months later, the gardens of the Iron Fortress bloomed for the first time in recorded memory. Not just the courtyard gardens that the groundskeeper had maintained through sheer stubbornness, but wild gardens, roses climbing the stone walls, ivy threading through the battlements, jasmine spilling from window boxes that had stood empty for centuries. The fortress itself seemed to breathe differently, as though the stone had thawed along with its king. Cale stood on the balcony of the royal chambers, their chambers now, and watched the sun set in colors so vivid they still startled him. Gold, crimson, violet. After 300 years of grey, he sometimes stopped in the middle of a corridor just to stare at the color of a tapestry. Eowyn found him there, as she often did. She leaned into his side, and his arm came around her with the ease of a man who had learned, slowly and with great wonder, that warmth was not something that would be taken from him again. "A letter arrived," she said, "from Ashwood." Cale's arm tightened. His wolf stirred, not with the old frenzy, but with a steady protective rumble that had become as constant as his heartbeat. "Lord Maron?" "His son. Maron has been removed from his position by his own pack council. Apparently ruling through cruelty becomes less popular when the kingdom next door proves there is another way." She paused. "The son asks for a trade alliance, and he enclosed a personal letter. To me." She held it up. Cale could see, even from the outside, that the paper was expensive and the seal was pressed deep. "He apologizes," Eowyn said, "on behalf of his house, for the treatment of an honored wolf who should have been recognized and protected." "Do you want me to burn it?" Eowyn smiled. It was the smile that still made his wolf go quiet, and his chest fill with something so vast he could not name it. Not after 3 centuries without words for warmth, for joy, for the specific ache of loving someone so completely that the world reorganized itself around her. "No," she said. "I want to frame it and hang it in the great hall, next to the piece of bread." He looked at her. "You kept the bread?" "You kept the bread. I found it in your desk drawer 3 days after I arrived, wrapped in cloth. The only gift out of 48 that you touched with your own hands." Cale pulled her closer. The sunset painted them both in gold, and below them the gardens bloomed, and in the distance a wolf howled, not in grief, not in warning, but in the simple, uncomplicated joy of being alive in a world that had finally, after 300 years of winter, remembered what spring felt like. "It was the only one worth keeping," he said. And the Luna of the Iron Sovereignty, who had once been no one's daughter, who had walked into a king's fortress with empty hands and a full heart, pressed her face against his chest, and listened to the heartbeat that she had restarted with a crust of bread and the stubborn, luminous refusal to believe that a frozen thing could not be warmed. Where are you listening from tonight? I would love to hear in the comments. And tell me, what was the moment that hit you hardest? If this story moved you, subscribe so you never miss the next one. I will see you in the next tale.